Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be covering Path of Exile beginner tips. We're not going to try and get too in-depth. We just want to get you started and have some good foundation so you can enjoy the later stages of the game. If you do enjoy this video, please consider giving it a like and consider subscribing so you can check out my other content as I release it. And if you have any questions or additional tips that you would like to share with other people watching this video, then please do leave a comment below. Without further ado, let's get into this. So the first thing is, which league are you going to play in before you start your character? The standard league is a permanent league, and by default it is softcore. So when you die, you don't lose your character. The hardcore mode, if you die, you do lose the character and it gets shifted to the softcore mode. And then solo self-found, you are not able to trade or party with other members, so you have to really know the crafting system and everything to get the full worth out of that, so I wouldn't recommend that for your first time. Next, you go into the temporary league, which in this video is the Metamorph League. These leagues last about 3 months at a time, and you still have the hardcore option and the solo self-found option. And when you play these temporary leagues, the economy will reset every single time, so everybody's back to the very beginning. That does not happen in the standard league. Like I mentioned, is permanent, so everything that you gain in there stays there. But in these temporary leagues, everything resets, all the gear and items and everything that you have, you lose all that when you go into it. And then at the very end of the league, everything gets transferred over to the standard league. I think you could go either way. You could play standard for your first time through, or you could do the temporary league. Either way, I think is a good choice. Hardcore is something I would consider not doing on your first time through, unless you're really experienced with those type of game modes, or you really just want to feel pain. Now that you've picked your league, let's take a look at the characters. So in my opinion, which character you stick with is really not that important in this game, as picking a character really just decides where you're going to start on the passive skill tree. Just about every build is viable with every character. But one thing that you do want to consider is that there are now ascendancy classes for each character, and that can really have a pretty big impact on individual builds or optimize them in ways that make them better overall for certain builds. So that is something you want to consider. I think it is worth looking up some build guides and maybe getting an idea of what kind of build suits your playstyle before deciding. Each core character has stats that they specialize in initially, but they're able to move around the skill tree and pick up other ones. For example, the Ranger focuses on dexterity, but you're able to go around and get intelligence or strength nodes as well on the skill tree. Now that you've got your character selected, there are a couple settings that I always take a look at when I first get into the game. One of the things I always adjust is the map zoom. I always move this to the far left. It zooms the map all the way out so I can see more of the surrounding area. I always find that important. I always like to make sure I have always highlight checked, so it highlights chests and things like that in the area, and always show sockets so I can see all the sockets on all pieces of gear that I'm picking up, as it can come in handy. I also like to turn on show full descriptions, show life and mana levels, show flask buffs, and show aura icons at the top left. And then I also like to have on mini life bars on allies and mini life bars on enemies. And at the very bottom, you'll see a list of item filters, so you can have your own customized item filter in Path of Exile. Custom item filtering may not be necessarily in the early stages of the game, but believe me, later on, you're definitely going to want this. So it's something to look into. I would recommend using filterblade.xyz. Neversync's filter blade's fantastic. It has a bunch of different styles, a bunch of different strictness levels that you can learn, and you can customize it however you want. And it's very easy to install. You just download and then put it in the appropriate folder on your computer and then apply it in the game. One thing I just want to add, while I was making this video, Neversync updated his filter blade loot filter. So now you can still download it and put it into the folder if you want to, but now if you actually sign up on the Filterblade XYZ website using your Path of Exile account, you can actually sync that over to the game through the website instead of having to import it into a document folder. So now it just makes it a little bit easier for you. Now we're going to talk about leveling in Path of Exile and some tips to help you get through the story. For starters, you may want to take a peek at a build guide for your character to help you with the path along the skill tree. I'll put some links in the description below on some great resources to help you find a nice guide for your character. Try to focus on finding gear with movement speed. You can buy this from the vendors or it could come as drops, but anything that helps you move a little bit faster is definitely going to help you clear that story much quicker. I wouldn't recommend killing every monster in every area. You'll end up over leveling yourself and then going to areas where you don't get much experience, if any at all. I think it's good to always try and stay a couple levels below what the enemies are in the area, and on PC you can just hit tab on your keyboard and it'll bring up the area map, and you can see in the top right corner what the level of the monsters are in that zone. When I'm playing through the story, I tend to run past a lot of monsters, not really focusing on most of them, just trying to get through to the next zone. Like we talked about previously, you may want to consider getting a loot filter. I don't think it's completely necessary early on in the game, but like I said, later on you're going to be glad you have it. And Never Sinks loot filter filterblade.xyz is what I would recommend. On your first time through, I would try to do all the quests that the game gives you, talk to all the NPCs in town to get more quests, and just do all of them, even if they're optional. You will find, as you do the story multiple times, that some quests are not really necessary. There's a couple that give you some things you don't really need to get to the end game, so you can eventually learn to ignore those quests, but for your first time through, I would just do everything, clear all the content. Try not to worry too much about dying in the early stages of the game. Between Act 1 and 5, you're not going to take any experience loss when you die. From Act 6 to 10, you'll take 5% every time you die, and then after that it's a 10% loss, and the 10% definitely does become a burden later on, but early on, don't really worry about it too much, just try to enjoy it. To go along with leveling, I did want to share a quick trick to kind of help speed things along. You don't need to use a portal scroll to get back to town every single time. In the beginning stages of the game, you actually might run a little low on these scrolls. What you can do instead is just exit the game to the character select screen and then load back in the character. This will put you back in town, save you some time, and help you keep a portal scroll. And the last tip is pretty straightforward. Try to enjoy the game, have fun with it, go through the content, have a good time. If you're not really enjoying it, then what's the point of playing it after all? Like mentioned before, picking a class does not actually determine what your build can be, so virtually every class in the game can do the same build, although some ascendancies are going to be better suited towards certain builds than others. Skill gems are what we use to determine what active skills you have for your class, and ultimately what your build will be. There are a lot of different active skill gems, vol skills, and support skills, so let's cover some of that information now. Firstly, there are 4 different types of sockets that you need to be aware of in Path of Exile. Red sockets use the strength stat, green sockets use the dexterity stat, blue sockets are intelligence, and white sockets which support any color gem within the game. There are limits as to how many sockets each type of equipment can have. Generally, belts, amulets, rings, and quivers do not have sockets, but there are a couple exceptions. One-handed weapons and shields can have up to 3 sockets max. Boots, helmets, and gloves can have up to 4 sockets. Body armors and two-handed weapons can have up to 6 sockets. There are also rules on item level versus how many sockets they can have, which I'll put up a display here on the screen so you can kind of get an idea of those. On top of sockets, we have links, so you can link different sockets together. So the purpose of this is if you have a skill put into one socket and you have a support skill that you would like to attach to it, then you can put it into the socket that is linked with it, and then that support skill will actually improve that active skill that you have. Generally, for larger builds such as a 6-socket chest piece like we have here, the order doesn't necessarily matter. That generally only matters for trigger gems, which we're not really going to be discussing, but something you may want to keep in mind. Not every support gem works with every active skill in the game, but if you hover over top of a support gem, it will compare it to the active gems that you do have in your build currently, and it will give you a check mark if it is compatible with it, and an X if it is not, so that way you know whether or not it's worth slotting and linking together with an active skill. One thing to consider when leveling gems is you're allowed to have 2 sets of weapons on hand. So if you have a gem that you're going to need later on, but you're already able to equip it, but maybe don't have space, consider adding a weapon or weapons into your second set and then putting those gems into it, because even though you won't be using it, it will actually still gain experience, so you can actually level gems on the side. This is something that can be done in the end game as well to level more valuable gems so that maybe you can sell them off to other players. While I would recommend following a build guide to help you along and get a better understanding of how the skill gems work, I would also recommend just trying them out for yourself. Just slot them in there, throw some supports on them, and get a feel for what you like and what works for you. You may find some pretty unique builds out there, but there's definitely a ton of variety due to the system. One last thing I wanted to talk about on skill gems was just a couple tips on skill assignment. When you first start up, your left click is used for attacking, but I like to switch that out for footsteps because I use it strictly for movement. You'll find very quickly that your QWERT will fill up with all kinds of other skills, but if you press Alt, you actually get a secondary skill bar, and what I like to do is put my aura skills in this skill bar, which are toggleable skills that give you and your allies buffs. I put them on the Alt skill bar and then turn them on, and then they'll continue to stay active even though they're not on your main skill bar. If you turn on the UI setting where you can see the auras in the top left of the screen, then you can manage them that way without having to look at that skill bar to see if they're running. So in the early stages of the game, you're going to get Life Flask, Mana Flask, some Hybrid Flask, but ultimately, for a while, you're going to feel like Life and Mana Flask are pretty much all there are. But there's actually quite a lot of flasks that are great for utility. One that I would recommend, especially early on, is Quicksilver because it buffs up your movement speed. I typically even run 2 at one time just to make it that much better. And then there are a ton of great utility flasks later on, which a lot of builds are going to have those recommendations of what you should be using. But don't ignore your flask. Constantly use them whenever you have an opportunity to. You can have 5 running up to one time. They consume at different rates, but you do want to use them as frequently as you can. As you kill monsters, they will refill, so you can constantly reuse them. One thing that I like to do, especially when I get to the end of my build, is I like to build out a macro to use the flask that I all want running at one time. So for this build, for example, when I hit the spacebar, it uses all those flasks at one time every single time, so I'm constantly running them. I'll run around, kill more enemies, and then hit the spacebar and continually run those flasks over and over and over again all the time. So all this just to say, don't neglect your flasks. They're very useful. As you find them, try them out, see what they can do for you, but just don't forget about them. Now let's talk a little bit about currency and looting. So I would recommend not picking up every single item that drops on the ground as you go. A loot filter is going to be really useful. I know we've talked about it a couple times already, but it's going to be really useful at knowing what you should and shouldn't pick up. And of course, as you learn, you'll know what you should and should not pick up. But you have limited space in your inventory and you have limited space in your stash as to what you can pick up. Anything that is a currency, like an orb that you can use to enhance gear, is definitely worth picking up. So you should continue to do that. And the other thing I would say is don't waste your currency on your gear. Be very careful with that. You're going to want to use it for later on for enhancing the gear that you use in endgame or trading with players. So really try hard not to waste your currency on stuff. Things that you definitely don't want to waste are items like Chaos Orbs or Exalted Orbs, Divine Orbs, things of those nature. If you are going to waste some, then use things like Alterations or Orb of Chances, maybe some alchemies here and there, but really don't go crazy. Just try and hunt for upgrades. Don't use those orbs unless you're really struggling to get through the content because your gear is just that bad. But I would recommend if your gear really is that bad, then check out the vendors. Buy gear from them if you need to. They will continue to get better as the game moves forward. And speaking of the vendors, you should know that there are vendor recipes, things that you can sell to the vendor to get currency or things in return. Like you can sell certain pieces of item to get Chaos Orbs. In this clip, you'll see I'm selling a Orb of Transmutation, and you see I'm going to get back 160 Wisdom Scrolls in return so that you can identify gear. There's a lot of really cool recipes like this with different vendors. I'll put a link down below so you can check that out for yourself so I don't have to waste too much more of your time going over things like that. And then eventually, if you get to the end game, there's some really great resources out there on how to trade and what the current prices are on different things. So you can check out websites like POE.trade or POE.ninja to see what different things are selling for, what the currency value is in the game. So that pretty much wraps up this video. There is a ton of content that I did not include in this, so please, if you have more tips for beginners, please leave them in the comments below, and I appreciate you so much if you made it to the end of this video. Again, please consider liking this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to keep up with my other content, and consider checking out one of my other videos, which I'll put up right now. And other than that, take care.